It's a little creepy. Yeah, no kidding. It was interesting too because what they also had was like, I don't know, 1920s or 1930s kids kind of up in the steel girders. You know, if they were up there messing around like kids might do and all that. So it was kind of cool. Some of the rooms were old train cars. Ours wasn't, but some of the rooms were old train cars. So it was a neat sort of idea. Let me show you what I found. You guys, unless you lived up there, been up there, or whatever, I don't know. You probably never have seen. This is a leaf. Oh, let me see if I can. Maybe if I give it a background, it'll help. If you saw my Twitter thing yesterday, you probably saw it on there. I'm not doing this right. There we go. If you saw my Twitter, I tweeted this. You guys see that leaf? Isn't that the neatest looking leaf? Look at the shape of that. I mean, honestly, I know leaves have shapes, but have you ever seen a leaf with, there we go. With that kind of shape? Isn't that neat? I don't know if you guys can make the camera really big, you know, if you can make the image that are really big so you can see, and it's not really showing about it. Now, I'm probably going to end up blinding you, but what I want to do is hold my light from my phone behind it so you can see the veins through it, okay, the venation. Again, I don't know how well this is showing. I'm going to bring these to school. That's a pretty good shot, I'll bet, right? Can you all see the veins there? Yeah. Let me turn this off before I blind one, y'all. We don't have these down in Florida. Oh man, I'm so tempted to bring some of the seeds back, but there's a problem. There's two. For one thing, these are interesting plants in the fact that there actually are male and females of these. There are male plants and female plants, and that's not typically the case. There are some other plants that are that way, but I was going to bring some seeds back. But I thought, they probably wouldn't survive in Florida. I had that problem with invasives, it's really not a thing that a responsible biology person should do. But I don't know. I just love these. They're trees. They're called the maidenhair tree. Sometimes the leaves turn yellow. And the seeds, they're from China, and many years ago, because they were pretty, a lot of Main Street USA kind of stuff was lined with these maidenhair trees on either side. But it was important that you only had males, because if you got females, the females would produce the seeds, and when the seeds would drop off, they would start to rot and smell rancid. As a matter of fact, a lot of folks said it would smell like vomit. So as you're walking around through downtown, say wherever you were, and at that time of the year when this would occur, and those seeds would drop and begin to decompose. And we talk later on today about maybe why they would do that. But of course, from the person point of view, the people walking through the city, it probably wasn't a lot of fun. So many times they got rid of them through time. But if you have males, it's okay. I did find it was interesting in Indianapolis. They must have had, well, they had males and females, because I found seeds. So it didn't smell. They didn't look like they were decomposing yet. It looked like there was only a few seeds. But the other really interesting thing, and then I'll stop with these guys because I'm going to come back to them later, is these plants were very prominent, were around in large numbers back during the dinosaur era. Now we've talked about those. We said even a lot of plants we're familiar with today. For example, today we're going to talk about flowering plants. And there were flowering plants back during the dinosaurs. And there were cycads back during the dinosaurs and mosses. We've talked about all that, right? But these were around back during the dinosaurs, so nothing special there. But every plant in this group, every plant in this plant's phylum, okay, is now extinct except for this one. This is Ginkgo biloba, folks. Ginkgo biloba. Biloba. And you're like, well, I've heard that before. That's the memory thing. You take it and it improves your memory. You remember that? I don't know if that's popular anymore. I was asking my students yesterday. Nobody remembered that. But a few years ago, there was this idea or this thing that if, the herbal thing, right? If you take ginkgo, you can still buy it, I think. I should go buy some at Publix. I always forget. But anyway, it was supposed to improve your memory. You guys ever remember hearing about that ginkgo biloba? Nothing else has a cool name. So none of you remember that either, huh? You know, yeah. You know how like herbal fads fade, and because there's all subjective proof, right? And that's not really proof. But and so let me just for a second, and I'll stop with this guy, I promise. But think about the significance of what I just said. So the phylum that we're going to talk about today, you see it on the screen right there, phylum Ginkgophida. There it is, right down there on that little white part on the right. Phylum Ginkgophida. Phylum Ginkgophida is represented by this one species. So think about that tree of life. Think about that bush of life and how it branches off, and cladogenesis may occur. So you get adaptive radiation in several species. And so now today, we got, like, say in another phylum, let's pick another phylum. How about the phylum Chordata? You don't know what that is, but you're going to learn that phylum Chordata is basically the vertebrates. How many different kinds of vertebrates are there on Earth today? How many different kind of backboned critters do you think you could name? Just off the top of your head. Yeah, you could. I'm sure, right? Anything with a backbone, that's in the phylum Chordata. So there are boatloads, tons of vertebrates out there, right? So now compare that to what I'm saying about the ginkgo here. This one species, if this were vertebrates, to make the equivalence, I would be showing you this is the only vertebrate on Earth. There's no other vertebrates. Could be like, say, us. We might be not a single other creature out there survived. Now, as I said, back during the dinosaur era, these guys were prominent. And so if you think about that branch, oh my, I tell you, I was just thinking about this the other day when I was coming back on the plane from Indianapolis, and the guy next to me was a little passive aggressive and kind of playing the territorial game with the seats. So I was thinking about the fact that there's this branch of light that goes out, and we often think about how it gets bigger and all these different things and all that, but then like with the horse that we talked about very early on, sometimes what you really can appreciate, and the horse is not even at that because there's lots of vertebrates including the horse, but you really appreciate that this guy, this species guy, whatever, this species, this organism is the only one that made it out of all of its phylum. Phylum. You know what I mean? Doesn't that just blow you away? You think about what it, yeah. Just for me anyway. I don't know. Plus, I just think they look cool, and nothing else looks like. And I'll bring it. It feels neat too. It feels like fabric, kind of. Okay, anybody got any questions for me, by the way, before I get too far off track on, chapter 29 that we were finishing, right? The seedless, the seedless vascular and the seedless non-vascular. So, there's my pen. So we had gone through the liverworts, mosses, and the hornworts. So the group that we call the non-vascular plants, the bryophytes. I got an email from one of your classmates the other day, anxious or concerned about the fact that of these names of these organisms, like the phylum Bryophyta, like you're trying to follow those names on your field notebook. And her problem, or not problem, but her concern, her challenge was the fact that there was a lot of different ways she saw that, like she wasn't finding the phylum Anthophida, okay? And so I said, well, you know what? Welcome to the world of taxonomy. If you'll notice in your book, if you read this chapter that we're going to do today, chapter 30, you notice that when you get to the flowering plants, okay, the angiosperms is not a taxonomic name. It's not, order angiosperm or anything like that. It's just a name for things, okay? And then the phylum Anthophida is the name that we normally equate with organisms that are angiosperms. But it changes, and it depends on who you read about, okay? So when you look online and you're trying to say, what is this Anthophida, or the other one she had was Pterophyta, the P being silent, the Pterophytas, okay, which is just not too long ago, and it also depends on where you read, but I try to stick with your textbook. The pterophytes, spelled The pterophytes that's in your lab manual, they're in your field notebook, you're thinking, who is he talking about there? The pterophytes are the manilophytes. Okay, that's what your book is now calling them. But I hope that, if you do find confusion in that, when you look online, it tells you, I would bet money that if you look up pterophytes, it's going to say, oh, that includes the ferns, the horsetails, the whisk ferns, and sometimes it says ferns and their allies. Okay, so manilophytes is just the word that the author in your book has decided to use, and I have no reason to argue against him, so I'm going to go with his name. Now, again, you jump down to gymnosperms and angiosperms. Those aren't really taxonomic names. Okay, the phylum Monilophyta might be a taxonomic name, but like up above with the mosses were not in the phylum Moss, they were the phylum Bryophyta. So be very flexible in the use of these words and read into them and read what, if it says this phylum's name or that phylum's name, look at the critters. Okay, I tried to make the field notebook very obvious in the critters I'm looking for. I'm looking for flowering plants, cone-bearing plants, okay, things like that. And you'll get a little better, much more appreciation for that today, because where we're going to go, I think I finished 29, didn't I? Didn't I finish 29? I think I maybe didn't do the last slide that had to do with coal. Yeah, I was. I think I'd already done the whisk ferns part. Let me, we'd already gone through this and this and this and this. Right? Had I done the whisk ferns? Do you remember? Okay. How about the horsetails? Or did I stop it? Did I stop at this? Now this looks familiar. Okay, good. All right. Anybody else got any questions? Sydney, Nicole, Jennifer, everybody good? Marcella, how are you? All right. Excellent. Okay, so let me just finish up the non-vascular plants. Hey, if you got any questions from lab the other day, even if it has to do, because we're going to do the second half of the plant lab this week. Don't worry about it. I'll we can look at stuff from the previous week too if there was any confusion. So, all right. So following within this group. So what group am I in? I'm in the manilophytes. I'm in the ferns, the whisk ferns, the ferns and their allies. I'm in overall vascular seedless plants. Once again, no seeds yet. All right. Horsetails, very, very cool. I was running down the road the other day coming back from being out in the woods, and I happened to look off into the ditch off to my left, and the place was full of horsetails. I'd never noticed it before, so I took a bunch of pictures. Horsetails, so they grow here in Florida. The reason why they're called horsetails is maybe because they're kind of, I don't know, maybe stiff like a horse's tail would be, I suppose. But the leaves they make those small little leaves that we talk about, the first leaves that came out, the lycophiles, just those little extensions with like a little vascular tissue, like a finger or a tube. That's what these are. These are the leaves. Horsetails actually grow two different types of stems, right? The vegetative one, which is obviously where it's going to photosynthesize, and then the fertile one, where the spores are going to be found, right? No, we don't have seeds yet. We don't have seeds. We don't have pollen. We're still with spores. Now, horsetails were huge and large and very prominent back during the before the dinosaurs. The Carboniferous, remember, occurs before the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were a couple periods later. But today they've been whittled down, sort of like the ginkgo in a way, but not as far, to only 15 species, but all in one genus. So kind of close to that, in the sense. All in the genus Equisetum, which is kind of cool. Equisetum, equus is horse, right? Yeah. How many of you remember from the other day what I meant by homosporous? What does it mean that an organism would be homosporous? I know that was a week ago, so I can understand but even if you don't remember, could you figure it out from that word? While you're thinking about that, all have the same, scratch everything after that, all have the same type of spores. Okay, remember spores, like in mosses, mosses have a homospore, and it gives rise to a bisexual gametophyte. Okay, now when we're talking about horsetails, they produce homospores, and homospores are going to produce plants that have both the male and the female on them. So yes, but I'm trying to help you guys understand. The spore, when the spore germinates, the one horsetail spore, when it germinates, you don't have a male gametophyte. Remember back in the oh, I'm drawing a blank. Hold on, give me a second. Oh, in the it was the mosses, right? Yeah, okay. In the mosses, you had one spore, and that spore was a bisexual. That's the problem. The mosses, the spores were either male or female, so they gave rise to either the male gametophyte or the female. In ferns, the spore gave rise to one gametophyte with both parts on it. You would have looked at that under a microscope. So the ferns would have been homosporous. The mosses are heterosporous. So horsetails are like the ferns. It means that the gametophyte that they produce is going to have both the male and female parts on it. It's a bisexual gametophyte. A bisexual gametophyte in the sense that it contains both the sex organs on there. So yes, they can produce both male and female gametes. So you guys are right, but I want you to understand that the meaning of the word homosporous refers to the spore, not what type of spores. It's a spore that's going to produce a plant with male and female parts. See, although we take male and female parts as being very common because it seems to be so among the animals, among the plants, that's different. One organism, one thing can have both parts, but some plants, even back into the mosses, were already experimenting with a male or a separate part that produced the gametes, okay? Now, horsetails are really cool. They're called scouring rushes. And the reason why a rush is a name for a type of grass that's typically round, round, if you will. Horsetails aren't grasses, so it's really not a rush. But the scouring part is because there's silica crystals impregnated in the tissue of the horsetail. So pioneers used to take them and use them to clean out their pots and pans after they made dinner. Now, that was great for us, but step back for a second and see if we can figure out, why do you think there was silica? What do you think the evolutionary advantage would have been to have silica in your tissues? Everybody else is welcome too. Please jump in, right? What do you think the evolutionary advantage would be? I can call on folks if you like. Gabriella or Jennifer, Nicole, Sydney. What do you think it would be if you had silica? Silica, a glass, right? Scouring, it was rough. So, gosh, why would plants have that? Let's do detective work. Oh, how so, Jennifer? Elaborate with me. How do you mean protection from prey? You're right. Sure, they wouldn't want to eat it. That's right. Especially if you're a herbivore, you're a grazer. Grazers have these large, flat, mashing teeth, but they do wear down. Horses' teeth wear down from grazing. So if you're grazing on something It's one of the problems with horses in Florida is because of the fact that the pastures are so thin. Oftentimes horses will have teeth problems because of the fact that a lot of their pasture grass, if they're grazing, has sand in it. So it grinds on the teeth. So horsetails, if you're feeding on horsetails, you're not getting a lot of them. You're not getting, because it's gonna start grinding down your teeth, and it's probably not really easy to digest either. Okay. Okay, on to the last type of fern, the whisk ferns. The whisk ferns are called living fossils, and you may not remember, but I told you last week that a living fossil is something that's around today that looked like something that used to be around but isn't related. Like this looked like Cooksonia. I'll leave it up to you to go back in your notes and look that up. Cooksonia. Cooksonia was an ancient plant that went extinct, okay? But it looked, or these whisk ferns look a lot like them. Whisk ferns aren't related to Cooksonia. It's like convergent evolution 9 times over, folks. But you remember Cooksonia didn't have any roots. It had anchoring rhizoids, and whisk ferns don't have any roots. They've lost them during evolution. So that's an indication that whisk ferns aren't related to Cooksonia. We can follow the whisk fern lineage and know at one time they did have roots. Now they got anchoring rhizoids again, just like Cooksonia did, but only because of convergent evolution, not because they're related. So it's a living fossil because it looks like that organism. It kind of, as I said, convergent evolution 9 times over, right? But they're much more closely related to ferns. The other definition for living fossils, and while I'm on it, just so we remember, is an organism that we thought was dead, that we thought was only around through fossils, and yet we find out later it was alive, like the coelacanth, the fish we're talking about. Now, the interesting thing about whisk ferns and about Cooksonia is if you go back to the fundamental driving force in evolution, you can easily explain why whisk ferns went kind of, as it looks like, if you will, sort of backwards in time, right? They both are subtropical plants. They both Cooksonia lived in those warming early Carboniferous periods when there was subtropical climates. Florida's subtropical. You can see whisk ferns. There's some out at Okaiba State Park. I saw some at Kissimmee one time. But in the tropics, believe it or not, tropics don't have good soil. The soil in the tropics is actually really poor. So that's the problem with cutting down rainforests and using them for agriculture or range land for cattle. They don't do very well when it comes to supporting plants. Well, it's going to get sometimes it absorbs them through diffusion. Or even a bit through osmosis in some of the outer tissues. Photosynthesis is going to have to take into account some of that, and probably there's other secondary biological pathways that maybe allow it to create one nutrient from another. It's actually a pretty good question. I'm not sure, I know that a lot of times plants, like orchids, for example, orchids, grow on up other plants, but they really receive most of their nutrients from the air. It's something I should look into. Thanks. I have to remember to do what. That'd be a good job for you, Thomas. Look that up for me. Find out, and then let me know next time in class how whisk ferns do that. Thanks. Okay. If you could lose roots, this is a perfect segue too. If you could lose your roots and still maintain what Thomas is going to find out for us, how you absorb your nutrients. Remember, water is easy enough. You might be able to get it in the air, but nitrogen and those compounds that we talked about that plants need, that would be an interesting thing to find out. But if you don't need roots, things like that are specialized are, shall we say, expensive, right? They're expensive to make. They're expensive to create. They're expensive for organisms to maintain. So if you don't need them, get rid of them. All right, so let's just say that was the thing with whisk ferns. I don't need roots. I just need rhizoids, things to anchor me down. It would make sense because, once again, as I was going to say, in the subtropics and the tropics, in spite of what you might be thinking, it's not a good place to grow things. The decomposition rate in the tropics is so fast that anything that falls to the forest floor is so quickly decomposed, so quickly torn down into, individual chemical constituents, and then very quickly absorbed by really fast growing things. So if you're doing a balance of where the nutrients are in the tropical rainforest, most of the nutrients are in the growing things. The soil is a very short waiting room. Things don't hang around in the soil. So when you cut down all the tropical rainforest trees, what you got is crappy soil, which you then turn around having to fertilize. And again, it only lasts a couple years. The soil, then after a couple years, the soil is worthless. You have to spend more on fertilizer than you get out of crops. And so then what do? You cut down more tropical rainforests. So that's what we mean by deforestation. So you get the reason why, if you could take care of all those things, those other nutrient things, losing your roots would be a thing you might expect to happen in plants that live in tropical climates where absorbing from the soil really doesn't do you much good. It's kind of the same answer to why don't blind cavefish have eyes? Well, what do they need them for? Eyes aren't cheap, okay? Oh, last slide then. Seedless vascular plants, what they did to the earth. So here we are in the Carboniferous, which again, I always keep my little, what's it, 250, 300 and a quarter million years ago. Where am I? I'm getting good. 286 to 360, so 300 million years ago. It was nice. It was lush. And there was stuff growing. There were cycads growing, huge lycophytes, horsetails. Look at them ferns. It looks like tree ferns today, doesn't it? So there was these extensive forests that were growing during the Carboniferous, right? It was just wonderful. That's why we call that period in the geological history Carboniferous, remember? You dig down into the rock, and when you get about 300 million years ago, you find all this black coal material. Look in the picture in the lower right. That's where our coal comes from. All that peat with time and pressure and heat was turned into lignite and then turned into coal. So most of the coal we dig on the ground is from critters that died about 400 million years ago, right? Or 200, what did we say, 400 million years ago? Yeah, 275 million years ago. 400 would be a little bit more the Silurian. Okay, so as these forests get larger, as you can probably imagine, if you look in the chart on the lower left, if I gave you, like I say, a question, and you said, hey, relate extensive forestation, forests just growing like crazy with carbon dioxide levels, none of you be surprised that as forests got bigger, carbon dioxide levels went down, right? Forests use carbon dioxide, plants use carbon dioxide. And when carbon dioxide levels drop, okay, here's the problem. It's the opposite of what we got going on today. We're one of the biggest producers of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through things called anthropogenic, things that humans do. And that's what's causing the earth to get warm, okay? That's not disputed by anybody. It's all accepted by the climatologist that the earth is getting warmer. But back in the Carboniferous, we know what can happen when carbon dioxide levels change. When they dropped in the Carboniferous, the temperatures dropped, okay? A lot of atmospheric carbon, too, that would have normally been up there was actually being incorporated into the shells of marine organisms that were diversifying. See, the shells of mollusks, clams, oysters are made of calcium carbonate. Carbonate is just carbon dioxide with another oxygen. So a lot of the oceans became a sink for carbon dioxide. So we're taking carbon dioxide out of the air. Global temperatures are dropping. Okay, so the Earth's getting cooler. This is the coal, right? 6 million tons of it you burned a year. Oh my God, it's the worst stuff in the world to burn. We need to find some way to get off of it. They say we may have 400 years left. Let's hope not. Let's hope we don't burn it for another 400 years. Okay, so here we are at the end of the Carboniferous. When things get cold, they also get wet. We often think about the Arctic or the Antarctic as being snowy and cold and wet. It's really snowy, cold, and dry. It's very, very dry. So at the end of the Carboniferous, so we're leaving this period now of 286 million years ago or so. We're starting to see this shift towards, hey, if you got some way to deal with dry, if you got some ideas for living in a drier climate, then you might have an advantage. And guess who had an idea for that? Right? The plants that we haven't talked about yet. The plants that are on the next chapter, the ones, see, we have not seen seeds yet. Don't confuse that. Right, we're going to see seed plants next. Now, a seed plant is similar evolutionary, it's a similar evolutionary jump as when organisms began laying amniotic eggs. All right, I'm going to type that word in. Where's my mouse? There we go. Amniotic eggs, okay? Just keep that in your brain. You may know what that means. It means having an amniotic sac. But it's always incredibly mind-boggling to me to think about the evolution of life on Earth being tied to the environment, how plants and animals faced with similar things, how to not dry out. They both came up with very different but fundamentally and functionally similar ideas. Protect the young. Protect the young. Put the young in a seed. Put the young in an egg. So if you can't depend on water, okay, then you got to bring the water with you. All right. And that's what the seed plants kind of did, right? They gave a chance for their offspring to survive in these drier climates. I think, oh, I'm done. I have to share the new thing. Are there animals who have an amniotic egg? Yes, we have an amniotic egg. Reptiles have, and birds do. Amniotic egg means you have the amniotic sac around the young. The amniotic sac is full of fluid. The fluid keeps the embryo from drying out. So now reptiles can do that. Birds can do that. We can do that. Frogs and toads lay eggs, but they lay eggs in water. They don't have an amniotic sac. They're called put an A in front of the word, amniotic eggs. But like I said, we're seeing the same thing. Pay attention to what I'm doing here. We're seeing the same thing happen in the plants that happens in the animals, even to the point, does anybody know what these are? You live in Florida, you may have seen them. That I'm not holding, yeah, God, there you go. They're called actually mangrove pencils. They look like pencils. And notice the one that up here actually has roots. You see these sometimes floating in the water, right? They'll be floating vertically. Now, the way mangroves disperse their seeds, or one of the ways that they try to spread out, is these mangrove pencils float vertically in the water. They bob up and down, they bob up and down. And if they don't float out to sea, which you imagine probably a lot of them do, right? But if they don't float out to sea and they happen to get closer to shore, eventually, how can I draw it right, Steve? Here we go. Oh, the shoreline will come up. Gosh, I'm horrible. So as the seed is floating in this way, eventually it'll touch shore. Now, once it touches ground, look at that. Start making roots. And it grows up, expands, makes those prop roots, more seeds drop. You get the idea, right? You get a mangrove island. That's how those red mangroves with the prop roots grow. We actually have a name for these kinds of seeds. It's a name we have for a type of reproduction that you and I actually engage in, us humans engage in. It's not exactly used in the proper definition with the seeds, but the word is viviparous. Viviparous means you give birth to live young. You don't lay an egg. The young exit the female alive. What humans do, okay? Seeds aren't dead of plants, but typically they need to germinate. It's kind of a suspended animation state. You know, you could take bean seeds that you in Publix that have been seeds for, gosh, there's a limit, but gosh knows how long. Put them in the ground, it'll grow. But with red mangroves, because of where they grow, because of this idea that if you find shallow land, environment, you better be ready to go. So we say that when mangrove seeds are produced, they're in a very, very, very advanced state. They're really well beyond the germinating. They're just itching. They're just ready. They're just like, go ahead, give me land. I'm ready to go. They're like a baby being born for first grade, if you will, which would be horrible on the mother. But you get the idea, right? Okay, so there's this idea again of protecting the young and giving them a chance, giving them an advantage. And that's what seed plants were doing. So here we are back, oh gosh. So we're getting toward the end of the Carboniferous. So again, we're moving into the Permian. We're moving into the Permian. 286 million years ago, The amphibians are popular. The dinosaurs are probably, or the reptiles are starting to evolve, not dominant yet because we're not into the dinosaur era yet. Okay, so I'm kind of giving you what the animals were. So it's still marshy kind of area, but along came these things because remember, when areas start to dry out or change, then there's a chance for diversification. So we get these things called the progymnosperms. Now we're gonna talk about gymnosperms today, and I'll tell you what that word means. But the pro means these were the plants that were, these were the transitional ones. Okay, these were they weren't really gymnosperms. They were kind of right before it, maybe right before it. Maybe it doesn't necessarily. It might to cladogenesis. Might have few ancestors, but oftentimes, or obviously with gradualism, you might have just sequence of changes. All right, but about 360 million years ago, so as we're getting right before the Carboniferous period, remember what we think about in evolution, it's not a ladder like Aristotle. Remember, if it is a ladder, it's more a matter of ladders in which rungs start everywhere up along. While the seedless plants were rising to dominance, and the ferns and the cycads and the horsetails and all the guys we talking about were having a party and just whooping it up there in the Carboniferous, even before that time, even before the Carboniferous, even before when the seedless plants had their heyday, okay, during the Carboniferous, the other seed plants were already starting out. That's why I always say during the dinosaur era, there were already mammals, even some cases very early on. So there was already those kinds of critters out there. It wasn't a ladder. It was very much all mixed in. So even before the Carboniferous, we have this Archaeopteryx. Wow, that's very close to Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx, okay? Archaeopteryx was heterosporous, so now we got this male and female idea. Okay, so we have a male plant and a female plant, but it was seedless. All right, but it was seedless. So my guess is what it did is it produced male and female spores on sporangia, like you see in the picture there, and the spores then germinated into male and female gametophytes, and the situation went around, pretty much what we're talking about. But it was the seed that made the difference, okay? Once these plants figured out this way or developed this ability to make seeds, it provided three really quick benefits that would have been really advantageous during this time when things are drying out. Protects the embryo, provides food for the embryo, right? Gives the embryo a head start, provides a little bit of food so the embryo can have a chance. Who does that? Who else does that? Name another organism that provides a little bit of nutrition for a while for Junior. Even after we're born, right? Yeah, mammals. There you go. Even after we're born, it's the name of the group. Mammals are named after having mammary glands, right? That's exactly who's doing it. Look at these plants are doing it too. Allows for a dormancy period. What's good about dormancy? Oh man, I shouldn't have wrote the rest of that sentence. You guys are a sharp class. Allows for dormancy. What you can see why dormancy is an issue again. If you can't survive in the environment today, you're supposed to have less reproduction and die out. Oh, but there is a loophole. There's a clause. There's another choice you can make. If you can do it, you can make spores. You can make seeds. You can make cysts. You can make things that stick around, that can survive harsh periods, that can maybe wait for the environment to change. Or if the environment changes on a sequential basis, you can survive through the winter until it's spring again. Perfect way to deal with the environment, especially if you're a plant. Why especially if you're a plant? Why is this ability to produce something that can remain dormant during the harsh times so much more important for a plant than an animal? Now, animals can do it, yeah, but why is it so much more in plants than animals, do you think? So much more important. Okay. Anybody else? Jennifer, what do you think? What would you think? There you go. Good answer, Candy. Right. Plants can't move to a better environment. It's the whole thing they told you, we talked to you about in Bio 1, is the why plants have a huge central vacuole, because they got to store water. They can't go get it. So if the environment turns harsh and you're not really mobile, one of the ways you can deal with it is make something dormant. Now, there are also some animals that do this thing too, but a lot of times animals can just leave. Like, I ain't staying here, right? That's why birds fly south and north. Okay. Great. Okay, and then finally, do you like the way fruit tastes? Do you like berries, apples, oranges? Anybody out there who doesn't like fruit? A type of fruit. I don't care for mangoes. I don't like mangoes. But I mean, is there anybody? And I knew a friend of mine who couldn't eat berries because of the texture. Weirdest thing I've ever heard of. Is anybody out there who doesn't like fruit? Everybody likes fruit? Yeah, well, you're not the only one, right? Fruits are good to eat, aren't they? And in fruits, by the true definition, a thing is a fruit if it has seeds. So yes, that's right. The tomato, of course, that you all know about. The cucumber and all those kinds of things, those are fruits in the true definition. The reason why they're called vegetables has a lot to do with the business aspect of it and the way they need to be shipped. There's different ways that fruits are shipped versus vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to get into that, okay? But things without seeds are not fruits. A potato, you ain't gonna find a seed in a potato. That's not a fruit. That's a vegetable, I guess, if we want to stick with that. But fruits have seeds, and oftentimes, not all fruits, as we just found out, right? But oftentimes fruits are food. They taste good. So things want to eat them. And when you eat them, you might drop the seeds as you're kind of a messy squirrel up in a tree eating a berry. Or you might defecate the seeds, okay? You might spit out the seeds out the other end. And if they're made with sort of a durable covering, they might survive that. Come on, everybody's seeing it when you're walking along and you see some scat. You go, oh, those are seeds of something or other, right? There are even some seeds that have to go through the digestive tract of a particular critter or a critter in general before they're ready to germinate. It's called, I'm writing it out. It's called acid scarification. And what it means is that the outside part of the seed is so hard that it needs the acid of the organism that ate it, the bird, the acid in the stomach, to kind of rough it up first before it's spit out, before it can germinate. Okay? All right, a lot more on fruits later on, but we can see why those would be important, or those would enhance dispersal. And yeah, heck yeah, it is. And now, dispersal, how do you think fruits enhance dispersal then? We've talked about all the good things that they are, but how do you think that enhance, from the plant's point of view, a plant going, I'll make a fruit. That'll help me disperse. What do you think was the Sydney, what do you think? Marcelo, or you, Nicole? What do y'all think? How does the key word here is enhance dispersal? That's right, because that's what dispersal is all about. In fruits, if something would take it away, then you're going to enhance dispersal. And remember, the reason why I say dispersal is important is because it's every man for himself, everything for itself. And I don't mean to mean, in a horrible way. What I'm trying to say is, when it comes to resources, everything's got to get enough resources to survive. So dispersal is a good way. Many organisms do it. Most all organisms do it. Okay. All right. Okay. These 4 things that I'm going to look at, I'm going to break down a little bit further about seed plants. I want to look at their seeds. I want to look to what happened to the gametophyte. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It was moss, right? It was dominant. In the ferns, it was that little tiny thing you saw under the microscope. It was very not dominant. Let's see what's happening to the gametophyte as we move on into seed plants. Now, I want to remind you, the gametophyte is haploid. And I want to remind you about being haploid, that haploid is okay. Haploid is good. You can be haploid. But in a world that's very changing and very harsh, having two sets of genetic information per cell might be a better idea, only because you got to back up. Again, can't tell if it is, but it might be. All right, so we're going to take the thing that is haploid, that is perhaps a little more sensitive to the environment. Doesn't mean it's something wrong with it. That's why mosses are still around, but we're going to start to reduce it. And what I mean by reducing is we're going to make it smaller and smaller so we can keep it inside the sporophyte. You see, remember, the sporophyte is the diploid part. Remember the alternation of generations. Okay, more on that later. We're going to concentrate more on this heterospory. So we're going to concentrate more on this idea of producing spores that are both male and female. And it's not going to end up exactly the same way it does in the mosses and the ferns, but it's still going to be an extremely important part of what happens in the evolution of these kinds of plants. And then we'll talk about the naughty bits. Those are the naughty bits. Thank you, Jennifer. Thomas, you yeah, I'm talking. Try muting your mic and unmuting it. Okay, give me 1 second, folks. I forget when I'm here during the day and it's just Cooper, I leave the back screen door open when it's nice and he can go in and out of the yard. And I just remembered I'd left it open. He's in the house, but I guess I should probably pay more attention. He doesn't go anywhere, he just stays in the yard. All right, so the naughty bits, you know what I mean? The naughty bits, right? The male and the female part. So if you're a little bit shy about the naughty bits of plants, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to just kind of look away, I guess. All right, let's talk about this seed thing. Seeds develop from things called ovules. I'll show you where an ovule is in a flower a little bit later on, and we'll look at it here in lab. But that's what we get a seed from. So when you see something on a model or in a picture that says ovule or ovules, know that that's where the seed is going to develop out of. All right. Now the seed is an embryo. You can see on the right-hand side, the part that's in the blue, that's a little seed. That's going to be a plant. It's actually already got a root. Let's try a different color. Here we go. The root is going to be down here. That's going to be the root meristem. All right. That's going to be the part that's going to know to grow down. And up here at the top, if you remember, is going to be the apical meristem. And that's the part, remember, these are the parts that we show you in Bio 1 where all the mitosis is happening, because that's where a lot of the growth. So this part is wanting to grow down. This part is wanting to grow up. Any idea what these two things are going to be? What do you think those two things are in our little young plant, little junior there? Exactly. See, it's already got leaves. Now, so there's the new critter, but notice we're protecting it, right? You got the embryo inside. There's even a little bit of food. Look at that, stored food. Give the embryo a little chance to grow a little bit more. The more you let, the more you let it cook, the more you let it stew, the better chance it's got for survival. And then on the outside, you're going to protect it. You're going to protect it with an integument. You have an integument. It's your skin. It's a little different than a seed coat, but it's made out of sporophyte tissue. Okay? Sporophyte tissue is tougher tissue. It's diploid, remember? So you're going to cover with that sporophyte tissue, and that's what's going to make a seed coat. So you got this nice, well-packaged, developing embryo, protected from the outside world and with a little bit of a stored food. Now, if you look at a corn kernel, there's a corn kernel right down below, a sliced open corn kernel. If you take a corn kernel and do that, the part that pops when you're doing the popcorn, that yellow part that sticks out, that's the endosperm. The actual seed, the critter, the thing, and this is actually grown a little bit further. If you the seed, usually the corn, if you cut off corn on the cob, you're not going to see this. You see the yellow, that's the endosperm, but you might see just a little dot down here. That's the embryo. Okay, in this case, it's gone a little bit further because, like I said, you can see the cotyledon. All right, but all of this around here that I'm talking about, endosperms, and you'll figure out in a little bit why the sperm part in there, but that's food, okay? That's stored food. So that young developing embryo has a little bit to grow. When you pop corn, the white part you eat, you're eating endosperm. It's food, it's starch. That's why it's food, okay? Another thing about seeds, seeds are, as I said, they give a starter pack, and they typically have a longer dormancy than spores. Now, I'm glad I didn't want to just glaze that over. And the reason why I didn't want to is because remember what's happening on Earth again, right? It's getting drier. It's getting harsher. Now, there are organisms that can make it by using spores. Quite obviously, they're still around today. But what we're seeing is that if you have the ability to go into a habitat that allows for, say, a longer dormancy period, not just a few days, a few weeks, and maybe, throughout the winter, short term or even longer, then you would gain an advantage, okay? Especially if you bet right, and it does become what you expect it should come up. Not that you can expect anything as a plant. And of course, now back to this dispersal. Look down below. I found this cool picture of the different ways that seeds can move. They're not, seeds aren't all about just being eaten. Sometimes they blow around like milkweed and dandelion. Maple seeds, red maples will do this. Red maples here in Florida, you'll see the little tiny red maple seeds growing on there. And it's a helicopter thing, isn't it? It's a wing. So think about when it's falling, it's spinning around. Think about the milkweed or the dandelion, right? As they're light, the air is pushing, air is flowing. Beggar ticks stick to you, okay? Sandburrs, blackberries, they all stick to you. Cooper is one of the largest dispersers of beggar ticks when I take him out in the woods, for sure. He has tons of those when he comes back. Water, especially if you're obviously aquatic plant, like the lotus, cattails. Coconut, that's just a big seed. And of course, like we talked about, mangroves. Oh, the bursting ones. Remember the equisetum, the horsetail? I remember the little spores I said that had an elater. Here's the spore, then there was a spring. So these guys have kind of taken that idea, not necessarily with springs, but by bursting, usually by pressure. So poof, it pops open. Humans, right? We move things around. Okay, so typically seeds that may not necessarily get spread throughout the world the way they would. We have through agriculture, we have by being on our clothes, we move all kinds of things around. I mean, we do it even if not intentionally. That's one of the problems Lake County has with the folks who mow public property. What they'll do is if they go mow a public space that's got a lot of invasives, a lot of grasses, a lot of plants that aren't supposed to be there, then if they go to a place like Pear Park where they're trying to keep it more native, if they don't clean the mower and they mow again, they're actually dropping all those bad seeds from the previous place. So they've had a real challenge with trying to get them to clean the mowers well enough to not let that stuff happen. The mowers are acting as a vector, aren't they? Right? That's what we call it, a vector. Okay, now, how about this idea of the gametophyte, this sensitive part? Now, again, I know I must say it a million times, and I'm sorry if it gets tired of hearing it, but I want you to understand Aristotle was wrong in the idea that things get better. All right. If the only way to survive was having a reduced gametophyte, there wouldn't be those organisms out there who don't have one. And there are. Mosses don't. Non-vascular plants, though we see them, they're everywhere. The gametophyte is dominant. Okay, the gametophyte is dominant. It's one of the most prominent things that we see when we walk out there. Okay, now here's what we're going to be doing with the gametophyte. The gametophyte is going to develop from spores, just like it does in alternation of generation. But all of that happens, all that spore developing into the gametophyte, and then the gametophyte producing the gametes, all of that is going to happen while it's inside the sporophyte. Okay, and that's going to protect it from drying out. It's going to protect it from ultraviolet rays. It's going to allow it to support it. Okay, it's going to allow the diploid maternal, really stretching the word, tissue to take care of its young. Same thing that happens in animals. Same thing that we see when we talk in animals. Same thing we understand. It's all because the environment is changing, and these are options. These are ways that organisms develop the way to get around this diverse, changing environment. That's the beauty of life, folks. Nothing that the world threw at life once it really began, okay, stopped life. Life always has a way. Even that one ginkgo, through all the years, has still found a way to survive. So let's take a look at this in terms of gametophyte and sporophyte and what's changing in each of them as we move through. So let's start with the mosses. Gametophyte dominant, sporophyte is reduced. Sporophyte grows out of the gametophyte, dies without the gametophyte. Okay, there we go. Now, when we get to the ferns and the vascular plants, we're reducing the gametophyte. Remember, it's that little tiny heart-shaped thing. It's made from a bisexual, a homospore, because it's got both the male and the female. So the gametophyte is reduced. It's independent. It's photosynthetic, so it can live on its own. That's how we know it's independent, because it's green. The sporophyte, though, that's the dominant part, right? The fern frond, that's the sporophyte. Now, if you have a hard time remembering which one's the sporophyte in a fern, just remember the sporophyte literally means spore-producing leaf. And I know not all ferns do it, but ferns, you know, typically I was talking about the sori on the back of the spore on the fern. It's the sporophyte. Okay, now here's where we're going with seed plants. We're going to continue making that gametophyte, the sensitive part, smaller. Now it's going to become microscopic. It's going to become microscopic. It's going to become completely dependent on the sporophyte for nutrition, at least initially. So we're kind of reversing what the mosses were doing with the sporophyte. Remember, the mosses, the sporophyte is dependent. Now we're changing that around. So all we're saying is there are a group of organisms out there that, through evolutionary innovation, figured out that, you know what, if you spend more time, more effort on this diploid sporophyte, you get a slightly better survival rate in these really harsh climates. So the sporophyte becomes dominant. Okay, sporophyte becomes dominant. Now let's look at some of the examples and the names between the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. We'll talk in just a second what a gymnosperm and an angiosperm is, but gymnosperms and angiosperms have female gametophytes and they have male gametophytes. But notice, and I've highlighted in red, that they're microscopic, okay, and they're inside. In other words, that's not a separate thing. It's still alternation of generation, folks, okay? But in this case, what we're doing is the part where the gametophyte, all of that part of the alternation of generation is happening inside the sporophyte. Sporophyte's sturdier. All right, and if it's female, among the gymnosperms, we call it the ovulate cone. That's the pine cone you guys probably most think about. The little tiny cones that usually grow at the end of the branch are going to be the pollen cones. That's where the male gametophyte. So pollen is sperm, or pollen is where the sperm is found, and ovulate is where the ovary, where the egg is going to be found. Okay, and the flowering plants, all right, because we got the cone-bearing plants, that's the gymnosperms. Pine trees don't make flowers. In the flowering plants, we have the female gametophytes are inside the flowers, and the male gametophytes are inside the flowers. Sometimes, many times, a flower has both the male and the female parts. There are a few flowers out there that are different. Okay, any questions on that before we go on? We got one more thing I want to talk about, the seed and the pollen, before we actually start looking at the different groups. Everybody see the trend that we're doing? Everybody understand why this is happening, right? Mother Nature's throwing a curveball. Got all these different environments, different ways to survive, different ways to get around. And remember, every time you come up with, you know, I can deal with that. I can deal with that dry climate. I can deal with those colder temperatures. I can deal with less water. It means you're the only one in the area. You're the only one. You got the house to yourself. Thomas, do you have a question? There you go. Yep, gymnosperms. Well, what gymnosperm literally means is naked seed. I'll show you that in just a minute. But yes, plants that produce cones are considered gymnosperms, and those that make flowers are considered angiosperms. That's right. Any other questions? Okay, back to the naughty bits then. The ovules and the pollen. Last part, ovules and the pollen. The ovules, ovaries, the female part. Okay, seed plants are heterosporous. Heterosporous. So they're going to have a male and a female spore-producing part. In the females, that's called the megasporangium. Now, you've seen this before, so I'm reinforcing one more time to keep in mind that the female gamete, typically in plants and many other critters, is the largest one. So when we're talking about the female parts that are going on, we have a megasporangium on megasporophylls, sporophyll, leaf. Remember that flowers, cones, everything is a modified leaf. It might not look like a leaf, but is technically a leaf, a modified leaf. You might think of the same analogy as your arms, really just modified legs. Okay, so inside of this megasporangium, meiosis occurs. Boom, variability, and that's all occurring inside the ovule, the thing that's going to become the seed. It's not the seed yet, right? It's not the seed yet, but it's going to become the seed. And then that produces a haploid megaspore, which then produces eggs. Not one egg, but several eggs. Okay, and that megaspore, that haploid megaspore, it's going to produce by mitosis. Right, so we get meiosis at the first division to get variability, and then we get mitosis, just like we've seen before, to get quantity. And it happens the same way in the male one, but it's all micro, same thing. The male gametophyte. The male gametophyte, that thing that, you know, when we look back at mosses, we noticed there was a male and a female gametophyte. Remember, ferns don't. They're bisexual gametophytes. Male gametophyte, in this case, as we move forward, is the pollen grain. So that picture that you see there, that's supposed to be in focus, but it's not because I didn't have my glasses on, are the pollen cones of a longleaf pine. And notice they look really different than the pine cones. They grow up further toward the end of the branch, and they're small, but those are going to produce pollen. And in cone-bearing plants, have no need for water. The sperm are no longer flagellated. They don't have to swim from water droplet to water droplet. Those are pollen grains down below in the little picture. And you can see that inside, well, you can't see, but inside of there is the male gametophyte, the thing that's going to produce the male gamete. So you don't need water. You can be dispersed by the wind or a pollinator, right? You could, organisms that brush up against them, you see it getting dispersed, folks. That's actually usually oak tree pollen that you see with that yellow powder that gets all over your car at certain times of the year. That's pollen being dispersed. Okay, now in the female gametophyte, the picture on the right is showing you the female gametophyte, a pine ovule that's containing the gametophyte. The nucellus, okay, let me come back to the nucellus. The integument, that's the outside coating of the seed. Come on, pen. Blue, thank you. Integument right there. Look at this right here. Archegonia. You recognize though, don't you? Notice now the archegonia is not something that's growing on that bisexual gametophyte. in the fern. It's not something that you look under a microscope and you see growing on the end of that moss. It's actually contained inside the sporophyte. The integument, remember, is sporophyte tissue. So you actually see 2 archegonia there. Now those will have eggs in them and they can be fertilized. You think, wow, that's a lot fewer archegonia than you saw in the mosses or that you saw in the liverworts, isn't it? And if you think about what I've been saying all along, if you're taking more care of your offspring, you can make fewer offspring, less effort being put into making multiple archegonia. And then the female gametophyte, you can see, is pointed to right behind. The nucellus, what the nucellus is going to become is when the growing embryo starts taking nutrition from the maternal plant, the nucellus is going to be, and I'm really stretching the word, kind of where the umbilical cord is going to be. That's where the connection is going to be. Yeah, right. Yeah, Thomas, you don't have flagellated sperm. I'm sorry. Yeah, there's no flagellated sperm, so you don't need to worry about having to swim from male to female gametophyte. Now, pine trees, as I said, oftentimes have male and female cones both on the same tree. Let's see if I can find a good place to draw. I'm trying to explain to you how they prevent inbreeding. I'm going to make yeah, there we go. Here we go. So a pine tree stand. All right. Now, and again, forgive my artistic ability. I'll just draw a couple of these. These are pine trees. And the ovulate cones are growing down here, and the male cones are growing at the tip, and the ovulate cones are growing down here, and the male cones are growing at the tip. And there's a reason behind this. Again, it's the inbreeding thing. Does inbreeding happen? Yes, of course it happens. There's nothing you can do about that. But in a stand of trees, let me draw one more, if you will. In a stand of trees, when the wind hits the stand of trees, typically what happens is it causes the wind to turn up, to be deflected upwards. So what happens is the wind has a greater effect the further out you are in the tree. So there's a greater uplifting effect of the pollen cone, all right, or the pollens, not the pollen cone, excuse me, but the pollen that's in the pollen cones, a greater uplifting effect of that than occurs here with the ovulate cone. So the idea is you minimize inbreeding because the way the wind blows, it tends to blow pollen further, hopefully finding the female part or an ovulate cone on a different pine tree, right? Clever, clever, clever. Does it always work? No. Does it work enough of the times? Yes. Is that cool? Now you know. See, it's always great to me in science. Come on. Here we go. It's always great to me in science to be able to understand why something happens the way it does. All right, let me jump up. Ovules and pollen, what we were just kind of talking about. Let's get some terminology down. The ovule, the female part, the megasporangium, the megaspore, the protective integuments made out of sporophyte. Usually it even has double layers of that tissue, very protective. So let's go to the left, and we have an unfertilized ovule. Okay, we have an unfertilized ovule, and inside of that unfertilized ovule, there is a megaspore. Notice the megaspore is haploid. It's a spore. Spores are haploid. Notice the integument around. It's diploid. That's the sporophyte. Now, the megaspore that you see there came from the megasporangium. See, the megasporangium is part of the sporophyte. That's why it's diploid. The sori, the sorus that I showed you later, those are sporangium, but they're on the sporophyte. They produce haploid cells, but they aren't themselves haploid cells. Megasporangium produce megaspores. Now, those are haploid. Okay, so there's the female part. Let's go to the male part. The same kind of process, although it's microspores and microsporangium, produce pollen grains. Pollen grains enter into the seed through a little tiny opening called the micropyle. Down there at the very bottom. You'll see it on the microscope. Sometimes some plants, they enter through the other way. I'm not sure exactly how they do that, but typically through the micropyle. All right, what happens next in that male gametophyte, or in that pollen grain, is that male gametophyte that's retained within the pollen grain starts growing a pollen tube. And that pollen tube is going to make its way from the micropyle down through the megasporangium until it finds the egg nucleus. And inside that egg nucleus, that sperm nucleus is going to appear. right? There's actually, and I'll show you, it's a little better picture when we look at the angiosperms. This tube that forms, in some cases, there are actually two nuclei. One forms the tube and one does the fertilizing. Okay, sporopollen, again, too, by the way. Sporopollen also protects the pollen spores, too. So the ovulate cone and the pollen cone, all of that's protected by that. You got to boil it in acid stuff, so that's pretty heady stuff. And then, of course, fertilization occurs, and there's the embryo again, right? There's the shoots, the roots, roots, shoots, and leaves. The food supply, the endosperm, right? In this particular case. And this is our gymnosperm seed. This is a naked seed. And the reason why it's naked is not because it doesn't have a tegument around it, because in the next group of plants, there's no fruit around this, right? There's no fruit. Okay, now let's get a couple of words straight when it comes to gymnosperm reproduction. Pollination is not the same as fertilization. This is also the case in flowering plants. Pollination is when the pollen makes the trip to the ovulate cone, when it gets there. That's where I said water's not required, that Thomas was asking about, right? The wind can do that, or pollinators. Fertilization is actually when the gametes fuse. Now, you'll see in a second why I'm making a distinction about that, okay? So, right, pollination and fertilization are not the same thing. One obviously occurs before the other. You got to be pollinated before you can be fertilized. All right, so let's keep that in mind and continue on. Okay, so now we can start looking at the diversity. We've already talked about the caryophyte green algae, the ferns, the mosses. And we're now going to turn our attention to these two sister clades, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, that were both, as I said, dominant during the dinosaur period. They started evolving before that. Remember, the gymnosperms are even before the Carboniferous. When the climate dries during the Carboniferous and there's less to eat, there were dry organisms like reptiles that were finding ways to survive. There were plants that were finding ways to survive in dry climates. And as I mentioned to you a long time ago, you can't have animals going somewhere. You can't have carnivores going somewhere unless plants are going somewhere. So it's all a dance hand in hand. The environment changes. The environment opens up. Plants got to go out there first. Then it's got to be the animals. And when we get into the animals, you'll find out that it's actually particular animals. Plants first, then usually insects, right? Because insects are the pollinators, and so forth. Later on, as time goes on, especially as later on as time goes on, there's a redundant word, but the dinosaurs eat these plants as food source, and especially after the dinosaurs die. Yeah, pretty close when the dinosaurs die, the flowering plants become much more dominant. The angiosperms. Angiosperm is angio means container. The fruit is the container. Gymno means naked, okay? So gymnosperm. Here we are, the naked seeds. Gymno is naked, and sperm in this case means seed, even though it's kind of confusing, I understand that. Okay, what we mean by that is these are cone-bearing plants. And what we mean by this, the naked part is the seed's not covered by a fruit. Okay, think about pine nuts that you might eat. That's not covered by a fruit. Now, don't confuse that with walnuts, because that is a fruit, okay? But these organisms, these gymnosperms, do not, the fruit is not surrounded by the ovary. They're not providing incentive to disperse. Remember, fruit is incentive. Come eat me, I taste good. You can put me out someplace else, okay? They're not doing that. They're going to be using wind, usually. They're going to be using pollinators, things that walk by, plants that or insects that crawl on them, and pollen sticks to them. Most of these are the things you think about, right? The pine tree. Most of these are what we call conifers. Conifers are just a group of gymnosperms. So you notice down below, there is no phylum Gymnosperm. There's a phylum Conifera, okay? And there's actually a phylum Cycadophyta, Ginkgophyta, and Gnatophyta we're going to talk about. And all of these are gymnosperms. See that? Seed plants, vascular plants, but no flowers, no fruits, okay? Down below, I've got a microscope picture to show you in a pine cone where the seed is. SD is the seed, okay? So the seed is right there, and that little wing that they grow is right there. So when you pull away a pine cone's scales, That's where the seeds are sitting. I got some in class. I'll show you how this looks like. So when you see pine cones on the ground that looks like something tore all the scales off, the squirrels are doing that. They're tearing the scales off and getting at the seeds. So the wind is going to catch these seeds and blow them out. And with the wings on there, they're going to float. They're going to float. Okay, let me get into the conifers, just talk about them. I got a few more minutes before class is over, so let me talk about conifers. So once again, we're in gymnosperms. Now we're in specific type of gymnosperms called conifers. And again, these are the pine trees and the spruces and firs and coastal redwoods, which are the tallest living plant. And then bristlecone pine, oldest living tree, which is, I think, something like 5,000 years old. Look at the defense mechanism, hence the name. Look at that defense mechanism. Remember, the cone is where the reproductive parts are, the seed. The plant wants to protect that. The squirrels want to eat it. So look at this here. You can try to get those seeds, but you're going to be dealing with some, some defense mechanisms there. Even though we find pines in Florida, this is a longleaf pine, rather commonly, pines are typically found in cooler, drier climates. Their needle-like leaves that you find in clusters have a thick cuticle, and that's because of that drier climate. Same reason why red mangroves have a thick cuticle. They have recessed stomata, everything to retard water loss. Now, if you're thinking, well, cooler, drier isn't Florida. Well, there is a couple things that Florida has in common with a cool, dry climate. Number one, it gets really hot. I understand it rains, but in the middle of the day, it still gets hot and things can dry out. And number two, we have nutrient deficient soil. Remember the subtropical, tropical conversation? We're subtropical. And pines and conifers tend to do better in nutrient deficient soils. One of the ways they do that is they never lose their leaves, and that's a great thing down here in Florida. It's good up north too, because while everybody else is forming leaves early in the spring, you already got them, you're already photosynthesizing. Down here, there's no reason to even lose your leaves, right? You can photosynthesize all year round. This is where we get timber, paper, resin, Taxol, which has anti-cancer properties. Again, real important herbal remedies that we find oftentimes have fewer, if any, side effects. So those are things that are very interesting to pharmaceutical companies. Okay, I have to stop there, folks. I certainly don't have time to talk about conifer reproduction, but we'll pick this up in class next week. We're going to be doing the second part of Lab 5. Your exams are graded. Please let me know if you have any questions. And our field trip is on the 28th. If you want to go, please let me know. We still got space. So anyway, other than that, I will talk to y'all later. Y'all have a good weekend. Okay, Jennifer, email me, please. Wait, unless I can find my notebook to write it down. Wait, hold on. I can find my notebook. Forget it. I'll write you down. I did already write you down. Yeah, I did already write you down. Okay. Anybody else want to go? Okay, folks, have a good weekend. Weather's going to be great. Go to the woods, get some pictures. Yeah, we're going to try to get the school van, but if we can't get that, I'm going to bring my wife's SUV, and I can usually cram at least 18, 19 students in that. You don't mind holding on to the roof like a deer. No, those are good old days. You can't do that anymore. We used to get that many people in the back of a pickup, I'm sure. But yeah, I've got space. Well, you know what I would do then is maybe you drive, bring some people over there, and then they come back with somebody else. Let me Let me find out if we're going to be able to get the school van, because that'll change things. If we get able to get the school van, then I kind of know what size, how many. Because we only have right now. I've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people going. If with you, that would be 7. There's another class going, but I mean, there are cars. Let me find out about the van thing first, and then we can talk about it. But why don't I just put you down anyway, Thomas? I mean, it might be one of those things that you could drive out there and park somewhere. Am I?